Welcome to the IISS this bright and sunny afternoon. My name is Rahul Roy Chaudhary. I'm the Senior Fellow for South Asia at the IISS and the head of the South Asia program at the Institute. For the past 2 years, the Pakistani Army has been operationally involved in counter-terrorism operations in North Waziristan, in the tribal areas bordering Afghanistan, in order to eliminate militants and their sanctuaries. 4 months ago, Pakistan Army Chief General Raheel Sharif directed the Army to commence the last phase of this military operation named Zarb-e-Azb. Security has improved noticeably in Pakistan since this operation was launched, with the Pakistani Army stating that over 3,400 terrorists have been killed and 837 sanctuaries destroyed. But it has come at a high cost of Pakistani Army and civilian casualties. How will the Pakistan Army consolidate these gains? What lessons has the Army learnt from Operation Zarb-e-Azb, and what are the prospects of achieving durable peace in the region? What more remains to be done? To respond to these and related questions, we are delighted to welcome our speaker, Colonel Zulfikar Ali Bhatti, who is the Army and Air Advisor at the Pakistan High Commission in London. Colonel Zulfikar is the first South Asian defense advisor based in London that the IISS has invited to speak formally at the Institute, not once but twice, and the reasons for this are clear. Firstly, the importance of the success of the Zarb-e-Azb military operations for both regional stability and security, which is also considered to be a legacy issue for Pakistan Army Chief General Raheel Sharif. And secondly, for the high value Colonel Zulfikar provides to this issue, given his highly successful 3-year diplomatic posting as Pakistan's Army and Air Advisor in London, as well as his personal experience as Chief of Staff of an infantry brigade in North Waziristan in the tribal areas prior to his London posting. Colonel Zulfikar was commissioned from the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst and attended the Advanced Command and Staff course in Shrivenham, where he stood first among all foreign military officers that year. As some of you may know, Colonel Zulfikar returns to Islamabad next week on his next posting.
All right. First of all, I would like to thank Rahul and the Institute for having me here to speak for the second time. I think the last time that I spoke was a little over 2 years ago, when I had initially given a briefing about how the Army had conducted the operations since 2001. And I think today, basically, what I'm trying to do is to give you an update of what's happened since then. So some of you who might have listened to me before, some of it remains what I gave in 2004, and then I'll take you forward to where we are today. And then obviously when we move into the Q&A session, then it's going to be a slightly more candid and fair and frank discussion, which is off the record. So first of all, talking a little bit about the strategic context, and I think within that, it's very important to look at the historical timelines. And I think it's a very aware and knowledgeable audience, but I think it's really important to put the historical context into perspective. So from 79 onwards, 79, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, this is the time that Pakistan really thinks as a period of strategic cooperation between Pakistan and the West. Then moving on to the 90s, you have the internecine wars in Afghanistan, and this is a period that Pakistan calls strategic indifference from the West towards Pakistan throughout the 90s. And then we come to the seminal event of 9/11. And that's when, again, the cooperation again began, Pakistan again became the center of attention and the frontline state on the war against terrorism. And then throughout that period, from 2005 onwards, the focus shifted towards Iraq. There was a resurgence of Taliban inside Afghanistan, but also, the creation of Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan inside Pakistan. And since then, we've seen this threat of terrorism and extremism become a global phenomena with the rise of organizations like Daesh or ISIS in the Middle East, but also not just there, but growing in global signature. So just taking you back again to the late 70s and the early 80s, I put up a few excerpts from British Prime Minister, then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's speech that she gave in Pakistan. So if you just look at that, it was all about a shared history which linked Pakistan with the West and the shared interest in confronting the situation that had arisen in Afghanistan. And that it was not just the Afghanis, but the Pakistanis and the world in general, which was interested in seeing the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan. And she also pledged that Pakistan deserved the support of Britain and the international community and the West to actually bringing about the withdrawal of its Soviet troops. So this is 1981. And it might have been lost in memory to some of the people around the world, but I can assure you that it's etched in Pakistan's national psyche of what happened in those years. And this is how a certain person was described, so goodness personified. And it was this person who was described as such. And he is Jalaluddin Haqqani, who is the founder of the Haqqani network, the famous or the infamous Haqqani network, about which there's a lot of talk when it comes to Pakistan, and who described himself as such. It was US Congressman Charlie Wilson. So this is the history. This needs to be kept into perspective when you talk about the current situation that you confront in Afghanistan, Pakistan. But we talked a little bit about the history of it. So geography is also very important. So this is a map of Pakistan on the right side, and you see a blow-up of the tribal areas on the screen. So there are 7 tribal agencies. Most of you, I'm sure, know, from Bajor, Momand, Khyber, Orakzai, Kuram, North Waziristan Agency, and South Waziristan Agency. So when you're talking about the militancy and the conflict, all too often it is associated with Pakistan, and it's not really, people understand that this is mostly a problem restricted to a smaller area of Pakistan. Yes, there are certain terrorist incidents happening in other parts of Pakistan, but effectively this is a small part of Pakistan where the issue resides. This is the border with Afghanistan. So we have about over 200 and 600 kilometers of border with Afghanistan, half of which nearly is between KPK province, and the other half is with Balochistan province with Afghanistan. And just a few snapshots of the border region. And the reason I show these is that there are, I know, some military men also in the audience. When you talk about sealing of the borders, cross-border movement, why the border is not sealed, please have a look at the area that we are talking about. You look at the US-Mexico border, which is pretty much plain, and America is a superpower, and it struggles to control that border. So when you're talking about a border like this between Pakistan and Afghanistan, that needs to be kept into perspective as well. So moving on now to 9/11 and onwards. We talked about the 80s where the issue started in the first place, but then coming on to 9/11. This is a snapshot or the map of the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province of Pakistan, and you can see most of it is green with a few blobs of yellow, and what each color represents is given on the top left of the screen. And this is where we were. So there was a bit of criminality, a bit of drugs, a bit of gun culture within the tribal areas, but there was no terrorism. And that's the point that needs to be made here. And then after that, when Operation Enduring Freedom started, and since then, initially in 2001-2, in the famous Tora Bora region, that was where the first influx of the Taliban from Afghanistan into Pakistan started, and gradually then moving down south into North Waziristan, South Waziristan, and then Bajor and Momand agencies. And then finally in 2006, 7, 8, it moved into the settled areas of Swat and Dir. Swat and Dir are not tribal areas. And I think that's when the real worry started within the Pakistani government and the military, when the Taliban had their influence growing inside Swat and Dir. There were lots of efforts at peace agreements, but there were pretty much failures. And the character of violence changed in scale, because in 2007, the Red Mosque or the Lal Masjid incident happened, after which there was a massive blowback within Pakistan. The creation of Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan happened in those days as well. So this is where we then came. So remember the green that I showed you, where we were in 2001-2. So by the time it was 2007-8, a lot of the green had been converted into reds and yellows. So it was pretty much a three-way divide between areas where the government had strong influence, areas where the militants had strong influence, and areas where the influence was contested. It was pretty much a three-way divide. And that's when the military sort of sat down, because I am talking just about the military, and we had an overhaul of the military strategy, because we weren't very good till about 2007-8. We were a conventional army, trained to fight a conventional enemy. We were equipped conventionally, we were trained conventionally, so we weren't doing a very good job of it. And I think we had some major losses in the sort of first 6 to 7 years. And that's when Swat happened and Dir happened, and we had to come up with a better strategy to deal with the militant threat inside Pakistan. And the military people obviously know about these 4 phases about clear, hold, build, and transfer. So this was the broad strategy that was built into place. And I think we are, in some places, we are in the hold phase, in the others we are at build phase, and there are certain other areas where we are in the transfer phase, depending on which areas you talk about. And this is really important, enduring peace achieved by eradication of the insurgency as a military and political force, and the amelioration of the factors that allowed it to emerge. So that's really important for us. So not just a victory, but we need to go down to the factors which created this insurgency in the first place. And as Henry Kissinger said famously, that the guerrilla wins if he does not lose, and the conventional army loses if it does not win. And it's very true. It's a truism for Afghanistan, because I think every tactical battle that the ISAF forces were fighting with the Taliban, they were winning. But strategically, it can't be called a success, rather it's a defeat in many ways, because the guerrilla has not lost. And that's what we are trying to avoid in Pakistan. We have to defeat the guerrilla, both at the ideological plane and also at the physical plane. And this issue about legitimacy, I think this is again something which we learned in some ways from Afghanistan as well. Because you're not just talking about, there's a lot of talk about winning the hearts and minds of the population of the affected areas. But for Pakistan, it couldn't be restricted just to the affected areas. You had to win the hearts and minds of the people across the country. So you had to have popular support for the military operations if you had to, if you hope to achieve enduring victory inside the tribal areas. So that was the issue of legitimacy. I think is really important for the military campaign inside Pakistan. And this is what we called the silent surge or the silent creep or the gradual surge. We started off with about 30,000 troops back in 2001 to when we first went into the tribal areas. And as we talk today, the number is over 200,000 deployed on just the western border. When you talk about the surge times inside Afghanistan, the total figures of ISAF forces was about 130 to 150,000. And this was for entire Afghanistan. And Pakistan is about over 200,000 troops deployed just on the western borders. And this is just a graphic view of how the operations have been conducted. So, when there's a lot of talk about, oh yes, finally Pakistan has gone into North Waziristan, as if there was nothing happening before that. The reason I show this is that Pakistan had gone into, there are 7 tribal agencies. Pakistan had gone into 6 tribal agencies before we went into North Waziristan. And we had done the Swat, and we had done Dir as well. So it wasn't just about North Waziristan. This militant threat resided in other places as well, which we had tackled in the last, especially since 2007-8. And basically North Waziristan was just the culminating phase of the entire campaign in totality. So I think when you talk about just the Zarb-e-Azb, it's slightly misleading in certain ways. It's a continuation of the process that had been going on for quite a few years now. And this is where we came. So if you remember the 2 maps that I showed you before, all green first, then you had a green, yellow, and red, the next map, and then after the operations that we conducted before Zarb-e-Azb started, a lot of the yellow and the red had already been converted into green, and there were only North Waziristan Agency and parts of Khyber Agency, especially the Tira Valley, which had then been left. And that is the point that Zarb-e-Azb was started to eliminate the last sanctuary of the terrorists within the tribal areas. So this is where we came in June of 2014. And as Rahul also mentioned, over 30,000 terrorists had now been killed or apprehended during this campaign. I'll briefly talk about my experiences as well. I discussed with Rahul. I said, should I do that? He said, yeah, go ahead. You need to discuss, the personal experiences, because that brings to light, from my personal perspective, what was happening there. And as he mentioned about that, my first stint in the operation areas was as Chief of Staff of an infantry brigade back in 2007 in North Waziristan. But I won't dwell too much on this because we'll come to Operation Zarb-e-Azb. We'll talk more about Waziristan, North Waziristan at that point. I'll go to my second time in the operational area, which was when I was commanding my regiment in operations in Lower Dir, which is next to the Afghan border. And this was just before I took up this post in London. And we've talked about the sort of the kinetic side of it. But as a commanding officer of my regiment, what was I doing? So there was a narrative that I built for myself. Because from my perspective, I identified very early on that at the end of the day, it's a battle of the narratives with the locals. Who's got the stronger narrative? And I think this is the kind of narrative that I devised for myself. And I was talking to the locals, to the jirgas and other places, that this was the main thread line that we were talking about. And especially that Pakistan army was not a foreign army. And that's the difference between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And it was our country. We were there to stay for as long as it took. And it was in the interest of the local population to support the army, because that's when the peace will return to the area. So it was in their interest to support the army. So these were basically the main thread lines of the narrative that we were trying to propagate throughout. But then also we were doing certain other things, non-kinetic-wise, winning hearts and minds. We've talked about this was a sports complex that we had built. This was a girls' primary school that we reconstructed. And what I did was, when I went into the area for the first time, I gathered my troops. So I had about 600 people under my command. And I said, we need to renovate one school from our own pockets. So myself, a commanding officer, everybody raised their hand and they said, yes, we will do it. So the first school that we renovated, and many of them had been bombed out by the Taliban when they ran amok there. So we said we reconstructed one of the schools from our own pockets. And then I went to the locals and said, look, if my troops can do this, it's not their children, it's not their schools, it's not their future. Why can't you guys come up with the money? Let's wait for the government, because there's issue of funds and all that. So we started something called the Army Public-Private Partnership Projects. And we reconstructed or renovated. You couldn't build a new school because that required a lot of money. But the school which had been damaged, we renovated them, I think, between 15 to 20 with the money that was given by the civilians then, because there was a massive response after we went to the public. And this is what we did. All of these schools, we had no government funding. This was done at the unit level, at my level, at my troops level, and the locals there. So we built all these schools, we renovated them, and obviously that had a very positive impact. So this was a children park. So the land was donated to us by an affluent civilian, and he donated the land. We built the children park there. These are an example of some of the medical camps that we established in the remote areas that we are going to. And these are the jirgas with locals. And this was really important, not just getting the people to your regimental headquarters, making them sit and giving them lectures. It was about reaching out to the people. So go to their villages, go to their houses, go to their mountains, and sit with them, have a cup of tea, talk to them about the narrative that I've talked about. So we are trying to bring normalcy back to the area. Taliban had banned lots of sports, they had banned shorts, they had banned music. So by doing this, we were not just getting the locals to get themselves involved, we were also sending a message to the Taliban and the locals that the army was the stronger party. We would defy the Taliban in the open and bring back all those things which the locals love. This is not something imported into the area. They love their football, they love their sports, they love their music. So we're bringing normalcy back into the area through these kind of events. And when we, as gradually I move forward, I'll let you know. So you can hear the music in the background. So you saw the music in the last video. Here you can see the dancing as well. So again, it's a local dance, local music. So gradually we were building that narrative, because a lot of people had bought into the Taliban narrative, banning music, banning the local dance. But we were challenging and bringing normalcy back into the area. So if you can see initially, it's the military and the police join in, then the locals join in as well gradually. So that's what we are trying to do, other than the kinetic or the military operations that were being conducted. Not very good dancing skills, but I think good enough for the purpose. Right. We hear a lot of talk about the cross-border movement from Pakistan into Afghanistan. Very little is said about the reverse movement from Afghanistan into Pakistan. So this is a slightly dated slide, but it's just here to make a point. This is when I was there. So these are the attacks only in Bajor and Dir area from Afghanistan that were launched against the Pakistani posts on the border. And I was personally, at the receiving end of one of them, which was in Batwar, and they're in the yellow in the middle, which was on the August 12th, because my regiment reached the area on the 10th, and only after 2 weeks we received this attack. The average strength was 150 to 200 people who were attacking, and we lost, quite a few soldiers. Obviously, many terrorists were also killed. But this is also a reality on ground which is happening. So it's not that somebody goes and attacks Kabul, and then somebody comes up with something, well, it's Pakistanis behind it. But this is happening on the border because we are stopping them on the border. And then it needs to be done on the other side as well, rather than blaming Pakistan. And this was the response to the attack, which I talked about in Batwar in my days when I was slightly slimmer and fitter. This is basically the last slide of my experiences inside Waziristan and Dir. And the reason I put it up there, I had a jirga with the locals. If you see in the distance, in the far distance, there's one of my very remote posts. And I held a jirga there. I was coming down. And as I was coming down, the locals who were standing here, they stopped my vehicle about 200-300 meters before this site. And they said that while they were coming down, they had seen somebody trying to plant an IED on the roadside. And this guy ran away when he saw these civilians moving down. So these civilians waited for me and warned me off. It was quite near the end of my time in Dir. And that was victory for me. Because if the locals are with you and they're supporting you and they're warning you off, because my soldiers, I had 600 people under me. They could not be on every mountaintop protecting the area. But if the civilians are with you, you have thousands of soldiers who are there to protect you, to give you early warning, and that's victory in such kind of conflicts for me. Moving on to North Waziristan operation, Zarb-e-Azb, which we started in June of 2014. This is a slide that I showed you where we came in June of 2014 when the operation started. Just a recap. So this was the concept. So I think the Chief of the Army Staff has also said it many times, that this is not really an operation, Zarb-e-Azb. It's really a concept. It's a national effort, which is along the length and breadth of the country, against all the financiers, the betters, the supporters, the sympathizers. So there's a kinetic campaign, a military campaign, which goes on in North Waziristan. But there's a more subtle, more behind the scenes, below the radar, intelligence-led campaign, which is going on in other parts of the country, against the people who support such activities. And we are trying to generate an integrated security mechanism between the army, the police, the intelligence agencies. So that's why it's called a concept, and not just a military operation. And that's the comprehensive response that I was just mentioning. So there's a national effort, then there's an international effort, or the engagement within the national effort. So it's a military operations, but that's just one part of it. There's also a talk about the resetting of the narrative, which I said was fundamental to this. And then we have the National Action Plan, which is a 20-point plan, which is beyond the purview of this discussion. But that's the comprehensive response, or a future vision for ridding Pakistan of not just the terrorism, but also the extremism, the ideology, the right-leaning tendencies, the intolerance. So that's all part of the National Action Plan. But obviously there is a lot of work that needs to be done in that. And then obviously you have the international efforts, part of which, as I stand here today, is to explain to the world what's happened, what Pakistan has achieved, and where do we intend to go in the future. These were the directives given by the Chief of the Army Staffs, and these were very clear. Down to the soldier, there were to be no favorites. And the reason he emphasized this was, again, the issue about the good Taliban and the bad Taliban. And a lot of people, again, say, oh, now Pakistan has changed the narrative. Finally they have come to realize. Well, I was there in 2007. There was never a good or bad Taliban even then. I was fighting everybody who was picking up a weapon against me, and I was again fighting everybody who picked up a weapon against me in 2012 and 13. So this was just a re-emphasis to the world that there were to be no favorites, and the others are obviously self-explanatory. But the last one was, I think, the most important. That's the biggest challenge as well for us, which remains about the temporary displaced people who've been displaced, and I talk about them in a little while. So the operations in North Waziristan, this is where we started. This was the first phase, then the second phase, and then finally the last phase. Maybe not a very public announcement has been made about this, the conclusion, but pretty much the military operations have come to a conclusion in all practicality, and this is where we stand today. So all of North Waziristan and the Khyber is now under control. There is no area in Pakistan which is any longer a no-go area. So effectively, the writ of the state is now established across the length and breadth of the country. There are problems, but the writ of the state has been established. And obviously, these are just for North Waziristan operation. These are the casualty rates, the area that were cleared, the militants that were killed, and obviously the soldiers that we lost to this battle. These are the few snapshots of the weapons and the, you can see all kinds of weapons, all calibers of weapons. You can see anti-aircraft guns, you can see mortars, you can see rocket launchers, all kinds of weapons that were recovered from North Waziristan, mobile hospitals, nearly 4 kilometers of deeply dug tunnels. And again, military men in the audience, you can understand how difficult it is to clear such areas with booby traps and IEDs. It's a very meticulous operation that had to be conducted to clear these very deeply dug tunnels and caves. Recovered explosives, rocket manufacturing facility. This was a torture cell. And again, they were very media savvy, as you all know. Propaganda material, training material, not just in 1 or 2 languages, in many languages. So in Pashto, in Dari, in English, in Urdu, so all kinds of regional languages, they have the propaganda material, the training material translated and then distributed. So they're really good at this. You can see all this, how to make different bombs and IEDs, the instructions within their pamphlets. This was what we call the brainwashing or the planning room. And if some of you have seen the statements that were coming out from the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan by their spokesperson, this was the background that used to be used. If you go back and see it on YouTube maybe or something. So you can see this room. This is where he sat, the spokesman, and gave his statements. And this is what was also captured. These are a lot of the IDs. They are very good at innovating the different materials that they use, rockets, pressure cookers, all kinds of materials which they use to prepare IEDs. So as I talked about, that Zarb-e-Azb were not just about military operation inside North Waziristan agency. It was also being done across the country. And this is again maybe the figures are from maybe a couple of months old. So you can see the operation, nearly 16,000 operations were conducted. But these are not military operations. They got small raids conducted by small intelligence police teams, sometimes military teams. And you can see the terrorists killed is only, the figure is quite low, because that's the kind of operations they are. There have been apprehensions, there have been a small number. But that's the, the state going to task against the militants, not just in Waziristan, but across the country. But all of this, the success that I've talked about, it's come at a huge cost to Pakistan. The psychosocial impact of the, the war on terror and the terrorism incidents that have happened inside Pakistan, it's tremendous on the children, on the future generations. We haven't had any place safe, from whether it was mosques or funerals or marketplaces. Everywhere these people have struck. And so there's been a tremendous blowback. That's the cost that Pakistan has paid. So very conservative estimates, 100 billion loss to the economy. I think more realistically, probably closer to 120 billion now. And then the military stretch itself. I've talked about 200,000 people deployed on the eastern border. I know there's maybe 80,000 people deployed on the eastern border as well. If you combine the two, I think more than maybe half of the Pakistan army is deployed. And it's a very difficult thing to sustain and maintain. And that's, again, a big challenge. Over 6,000 soldiers and common citizens have been killed and injured. And we've had a 3-star, we've had 3 2-stars, and many 1-stars who've been lost to these operations. The senior most British officer killed in Afghanistan is a colonel. And look at the sacrifice that Pakistan has made. The person on the top right corner, General Sanaullah Khan, he was my general officer commanding before I came to London. And he was killed in an IED incident just 2 months into my posting in London. So that's the kind of sacrifice that Pakistan has given. These are the total numbers. Again, this is a slightly dated slide. I think it's about 2 months. The figures are about maybe a month or 2 old. The figures might be slightly higher, but we've over 5,000 military people killed, over nearly 14,000 civilians killed, and the total number of casualties is over nearly 67,000. Coming to the displaced persons management, this is one of the camps at Bakka Khail, which was used for managing the TDPs. As I said, we had about nearly 2 million TDPs or displaced people from Waziristan and other areas. About nearly 1 million was just from North Waziristan. And we followed the Swat model. What we did in Swat was we nearly took out 2 million people from Swat, the civilians. We carried out the operations. After the operation was successful, we brought the population back into Swat. And we've replicated the model in Waziristan as well. And we are in the process of now returning the families. So the figure here is about 42%, but now I think we've gone over 50%. Over 50% of the TDPs have returned back to their homes, which is, as I say, remains the biggest challenge. The army chief said that the aim is to get them all back by the end of the year, which is ambitious, but that's the aim that we have. We adopted a 3-pronged approach. As I said, development, build better than before, de-radicalization, and focusing on the youth employment. And these are just a few snapshots of what has been achieved. So some of the road infrastructure, this is South Waziristan. This is again South Waziristan Agency. This is North Waziristan Agency. This is again South Waziristan Agency. This is the Swat Valley. This is again Swat. This is again Swat, a training center for women. This is a degree college for women, again near Swat. This is in Bajor Agency, in hospital. This is a technical institute, again in Bajor Agency. This is a hospital in South Waziristan Agency. We built quite a few cadet colleges as well. So there's one coming up in Swat, in Wana, in Miran Shah. There are 4 to 5 cadet colleges being built, which will obviously take in the youth from the local areas and educate them. Some of them want to join the army. So it's a step towards national integration as well. De-radicalization effort, just a word about that. So the basic concept is a lot of these people have been radicalized on religious lines. So they needed to be de-radicalized on religious lines as well. So that's what's been tried to be done. This is a Sabaun center, which is for the youth, de-radicalization for the youth, the young people. This is near Swat. So what we do is we bring these people in for about 3 to 6 months. We run a DRAD program for them, and then we send them back. And I think the total numbers that we have, so year-on-wise, you can see the distribution. So nearly 3,000 people have been, have been de-radicalized, and we call them beneficiaries, basically who've trained and graduated from these schools, have gone back. And the good thing is that most of them have gone back and become useful members of society. There's only a handful incidents where people have gone back and joined the Taliban. So it has been a very successful program for Pakistan. So how do we manifest success? So in my opinion, the insurgency part of it has been crushed. The terrorist narrative, not just in the Fatah, across the country, I think that the narrative itself has been defeated. The violence levels, they are down by about 70%, and here's just a small graph to show where we were in 2014 and how the violence levels have come down in 2015 and 16. There was an initial spike in early parts of 2016, but again, we managed to take control of that, and I think, again, the downward trend continues. So the economy itself, a challenge, but it's improving. There's a general sense of return towards normalcy. The national action plans I've talked about, that has basically a vision for the future. But I think it'll be amiss if I did not talk about the challenges, because there are massive challenges that remain. And when I was jotting these down, I mean, I had to delete quite a few of them, because there was slide on slide of challenges that Pakistan does face. But the good thing is we realize that these challenges are there. So as I said, the insurgency has been defeated, but the terrorism remains. And I think who better than the United Kingdom to know from your experience in Northern Ireland that this is a long-term problem. So we've taken the first step. Now the terrorism part of it has to be, it's a long-term process. The implementation of the National Action Plan in its true letter and spirit, integration of FATA into the mainstream, I think that's, as you say, there's always an opportunity in a challenge. I think from this challenge has arisen the opportunity that finally we can integrate FATA into the national mainstream, which we should have done maybe 70 years ago. But I think now is the time to actually do that. The effective border management and the challenges associated with it, and we've seen some of that manifest itself in the cross-border firing between Pakistan and Afghanistan when we are trying to build a gate on that border, sustainment of the military operations, law enforcement agencies, judicial reforms, madrasa reforms, the Afghan refugees, there's registered number is about between 2 and 3 million, and unregistered, maybe an equal number is unregistered. So that's a massive challenge when you compare with what's happening to Europe with the Syrian refugees. If you see, we have 3 million refugees or more inside Pakistan for the last 30 to 40 years. It'll give you some sense of enormity of the task. And then last but not least, the rehabilitation of the TDPs. And these are more the national challenges. And there are a number of internationally related challenges which also affect Pakistan. And the first is the issue about counter-narrative. So at the national level, we have come up with a narrative, and we are defeating the terrorist narrative. But at the global level, and people ask this question about why this terrorism phenomena is growing, for me personally, fundamentally, the battle of the narrative is being lost against the militants and the terrorists. The second is about patience, strategic patience. So when President Obama announced in 2009 that the ISAF will be gone from Afghanistan in 2014 or 15, 16, you're giving timelines. If you're sitting, in the shoes of the Taliban, that was, I think, the most pleasing thing that they could ever hear, that, the forces will be gone in 6 to 7 years' time. They could wait it out. So you have to have patience. And again, the example of Northern Ireland. So patience in counterterrorism campaign is a must. So there needs to be a regional solution without any proxies. Stability in Afghanistan, including the elimination of terrorist sanctuaries, and the growth of transnational terrorism, because that has an impact on Pakistan as well. So whether it's Middle East, whether it's Europe or South Asia, it has an impact, it has a linkage. So that's a challenge at the global level. And the absence of a global, coherent anti-terrorism strategy. And that's the key for me, because the situation is so complicated now. One man's terrorist, another man's freedom fighter. If somebody is, different groups supporting different groups inside Syria or Iraq. So we haven't been able to come up with a comprehensive, actionable, coherent strategy against terrorism at the global or the international level. And finances, that's always been a challenge. Still, it's the biggest challenge, I think, in the Daesh finances, where they are coming from. So just a few concluding thoughts. Just compare Pakistan's strength of over 200,000 FATA along the border. We have over 650 posts, and compare them with what's happening inside Afghanistan. Over 5,000 Pakistani troops have lost their lives as compared to 3,500 fatalities in total of the ISAF forces in Afghanistan. And if I may say, the Pakistan's northwest tribal regions are perhaps the only place now in the world, as we look at it today, where the battle against terrorism is being won. Otherwise, if you look at Syria or Iraq or Yemen and Libya, everywhere there are massive challenges. So I think the world needs to support what Pakistan is doing. And I think most of what I've said today is I've presented you with facts. But these are the only few opinions that I'm now giving you in the end. And that's the Pakistan I believe, you may agree with me, is committed to bringing peace in the region. But obviously the situation in Afghanistan is very uncertain. Pakistan military perhaps is the only force at the moment which continues to provide stability in that very unstable part of the world. And the peaceful resolution is linked to a regional solution. It's not a Pakistan-Afghanistan problem. It's a regional and an international problem. And that's how it needs to be tackled. And last but certainly not the least, as I talked about, a coherent global anti-terrorism strategy. Unless we have that, backed with a strong narrative, I think we will not be able to defeat this menace. Thank you.